During the Tudor period, the first queens to rule in their own right came onto the throne. It was Mary I, who was the first woman to rule as queen. And it was a time of some change. There were a number of women who rose to prominence inside of the royal courts. But still during the period, women were being used by men, and even the kings used women and dropped them whenever he wanted. For example, Henry VIII had many mistresses, and he did not really care for some of them, but instead he just slept with them and discarded them. When he pleased some fathers and even husbands, encouraged their wives to try and sleep with the king, as they believed they would get further reward and power from this using their wives and even daughters as pawns for their own personal gain, which is sad. But there were many remarkable women who today have been forgotten by the history books. We know a great deal about Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth I, and Mary I. However, what other Tudor women should be celebrated and should be known about today? We look at 5 remarkable Tudor women you've probably never heard of. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Jane Kennedy's loyalty to Mary Queen of Scots was unrivaled, and she was a woman who remained with her until the very end. Jane, following the Battle of Carberry Hill, waited on Mary I at Lochleven Castle. And whilst Mary signed the abdication papers, she got to know her. She even performed dangerous acts to practice Mary's escape, leaping from windows to join the Queen as she fled the island, and she helped to row the boat, which the Queen would escape on Jane, was then listed as one of Mary's maids, while she was held captive by Elizabeth I inside a number of castles she grew close to her. And Jane Kennedy was given jewels and clothes from Mary, and it's clear that they were close friends. She was rather senior, and she was very loyal. However, Mary Queen of Scots then took part in a number of plots. These plots aimed to bring about the assassination of the English Queen Elizabeth I, and then put Mary on the throne. And many Catholics across England, who would be persecuted, wanted Mary as the Queen, and they believed she was the rightful heir. But Mary went one step too far. After being held captive for around 2 decades, she agreed to take part in the Babington plot, which had the same aims as to oust Elizabeth from power. But with this, Mary Queen of Scots was condemned and was sentenced to death inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle. Mary awaited her execution, and Jane Kennedy attended on her. In her final moments, she remained loyal, and then even helped Mary onto the scaffold. When the time came for Mary's execution, she tied the blindfold around the former Queen of Scotland's eyes, and then wept as the axeman approached her. Jane had been selected for this duty especially, and then she wept and was close by when Mary was executed, following Mary's funeral at Peterborough Cathedral, of which Jane was present. She collected a number of Mary's belongings. She then went back to Scotland and informed Mary's son as to what had happened to Mary in her final days. But it's believed that Jane died in an accident in the ferry ports in 1589. But she was a woman who served Mary Queen of Scots greatly, and even remained with her in her final seconds. Anne Seymour, or Anne Stanhope, was the Duchess of Somerset and the second wife of Edward Seymour. The first Duke of Somerset, who was the Lord Protector during the reign of King Edward VI. This made Anne the most powerful woman in England for a short time, and she claimed precedence over the Dowager Queen, Catherine Parr, the widow of the previous King Henry VIII. She was a very powerful person through her husband's influence, and the couple had 10 children. Many of these children went on to hold significant positions in Tudor society. For example, many became earls and ladies, and her daughter Jane also became a maid of honour to Queen Elizabeth. I. Anne had been a mainstay at court for some time, and she was present at the wedding of Henry VIII and Catherine Parr in the July of 1543. Following Henry's death, her husband Edward Seymour was acting as king in all but name, and with this power, Anne considered herself the First Lady of the Kingdom of England. She would state that Catherine Parr forfeited her power by marrying Thomas Seymour, her brother-in-law, it was said. She even got into a physical altercation with Catherine Parr. At one point, Catherine Powell later claimed she had precedence over all ladies in the realm as a dowager queen, but the Duchess Anne Seymour was described as a violent woman. However, when her husband fell from grace, Anne would go with him. Despite wielding royal authority, practically Edward was later accused of many charges. Including treason with this, he and Anne were taken to the Tower of London, and Anne Seymour had a number of requests. Her best clothes were sent with her, and while she was in the Tower, but her husband was then convicted of a number of crimes, and he was sentenced to death. Edward Seymour was executed on Tower Hill on January 22nd, 1552. But the Duchess of Somerset Anne had been arrested, and she was held at the Tower for another 18 months. Following her husband's death, she would later marry the man who was her ex-husband Stuart. But today she is buried inside of Westminster Abbey. Her tomb is an ornate one, with a painted effigy on top, and after her death, an inventory of her jewels and money was made, as it was ordered by Queen Elizabeth. The first, Bessie Blount, was the woman who gave King Henry VIII all that he ever wanted. She was a woman who became the king's mistress, and she was the longest-serving mistress. The notorious king, she came from humble beginnings, and she was known for being a beautiful woman. But at some point she came to the royal court, and then she became a mistress to the king. She served as a maid of honour to the king's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And whilst here, she caught the attention of the king and became his mistress in around 1514. Their relationship continued for 8 years, which was surprising, because usually Henry VIII cast his mistresses aside when he was bored with them. However, Bessie's place in history was cemented, as she bore the king an illegitimate son, and it was a son that he greatly wanted. This son was named Henry Fitzroy, and he had a huge amount of titles and privileges bestowed upon him. Fitzroy became the Duke of Richmond and Somerset, and also the Earl of Nottingham, and he was the only illegitimate son or child that the king acknowledged. Fitzroy was shown off at court, and Henry, it's believed, was in fact planning to make the boy his successor, and he even considered marrying the boy to his half-sister, Mary I, to cement his claim to the throne. Henry Fitzroy would die early in his life, and he would never go on to be king, but he could have very easily been King Henry IX, if history would have been different. But after the child's death, the affairs Bessie and the king had ended the king. Then began an affair with Mary Boleyn, who may have been the reason behind Bessie's dismissal. Bessie then entered an arranged marriage with Gilbert Talboys, the first Baron of Talboys of Kilmaine. She was not after this involved in matters of the royal court, but there were comments about her being more beautiful than the king's wife, and of Cleopatra for a short period. However, she then retired from service when the marriage was dissolved, as she was becoming rather ill, and she died around the summer of 1540 from what is believed to have been tuberculosis. Bessie Blount was not necessarily a powerful woman, but she did something that only one of the king's 6 wives could do, and that was to give the king a son. Many suggested that Fitzroy should have been named his legal heir, but Bessie was the mother of this hugely important child. Now Margaret Tudor was the eldest daughter of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and she would by marriage become the Queen of Scotland. She married King James IV and served as a regent of Scotland. She married at the age of 13, and the marriage was seen as a uniting positive between England and Scotland relationships between the two countries were strained, and during the Tudor period there would be a lot of tension. Margaret had 6 children with James IV, but only one child survived infancy, and that would be James V. She had a modest household of 24 English courtiers and servants, and she lived very comfortably inside of Scotland with her husband. However, in 1513, Margaret advised her husband not to go and confront the English on the battlefield. But regardless of this, James IV went and fought at the Battle of Flodden against the English. During the battle, he was slain and was killed, and her 17-month-old son was now the King of Scotland, with Margaret acting as regent. It must have been a frightening time for her, inside of a country which was not her own. And the English royal family tried to ensure her protection. She was a queen by marriage, and not blood. And at the time, women were considered subservient to their husbands. She was also the sister of the enemy king. However, she then married Archibald Douglas, the 6th Earl of Angus, which was a smart move. This allied her with the House of Douglas, which was very powerful, and the pair were married in secret in the August of 1514. But this alienated other noble Scottish houses. But the Privy Council then decided that she had forfeited the right to supervise her son Margaret, then accepted her brother Henry VIII's offer of safety. Inside of the English court she was pregnant, and she did fear for her life as the Privy Council of Scotland was ruling. She managed to escape to different castles, and then crossed the border into England, leaving valuables at Tintagel Castle. She was well received in England by Henry VIII, and was housed in Scotland Yard, the ancient London home of the Scottish kings. She did later return north, and she would marry a 3rd time, but she was a woman who returned to become regent, and she was incredibly a strong Tudor woman. She managed to remove the Duke of Albany a coup, but was also a grandmother of Mary, Queen of Scots. This is what some would later claim would allow Mary, Queen of Scots a legitimate claim to the English throne. Bess of Hardwick was possibly the wealthiest woman to have lived during the Tudor period. She was a woman who, through a number of well-crafted marriages, rose to the highest levels in English nobility. She was also a very talented businesswoman who had stakes in many local businesses, which made her a lot of money. Little is known about her early life. But in 1543, she married 13-year-old Robert Barley, who was the heir to a neighboring estate. They had no children as Robert died the following year. But after his death, Bess was refused claims to the lands, but she still then was later awarded a claim to the Barley estate. But on August 20th, 1547, she married Sir William Cavendish, the treasurer to the King's Chamber. His money had been made during the dissolution of the monasteries, and he brought to the Chatsworth estate in Bessie's home county of Derbyshire. They had 8 children, 2 died in infancy, but after her husband's death, Bess inherited all of the property. She married again, a 3rd time, in 1559, to the captain of the guard of Elizabeth I and Sir William St. Lo. It's believed following his death left Bess the wealthiest woman in England. Her annual income at this time would have been today's estimate at around £25 million, and she was a lady of the bedchamber to Elizabeth I and became close friends with her, but she then married for a 4th time, and she became the Countess of Shrewsbury, marrying the Earl of Shrewsbury, George Talbot. He was one of the most prominent aristocrats in England. But during this marriage, Bess of Hardwick would imprison Mary, Queen of Scots, inside of her house at Hardwick Hall. She also lived in Chatsworth House, and Bess became a good friend of Mary's, and they worked together on a number of projects. But later Mary's keeper was changed, and she was then treated harsher. But following her fourth husband's death, Besson lived at Hardwick Hall. A huge Elizabethan mansion had been built. She managed to outlive her close friend Elizabeth I, and she died in 1608. At the age of 81, she was described as one of the richest and most powerful women in the kingdom. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.